Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest narration of the web series The Survivor Becomes the Dungeon. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 113, Bitmori Point of View. I find myself kneeling beside the cracked blue core, studying the damage, and doing my best to figure out anything I could possibly do. Try as I might, I can't really discern any clear way to help it, besides throwing mana into it to try brute force a fix. But I know from experience that something like that tends to be a rather painful process for those on the receiving end and that kind of treatment. Looking closer, I can sense a trickle of mana leaving the blue core from a smaller crack near the middle of the sphere itself. From what I can gather, instead of the whole missing chunk acting as a sort of gaping wound, it was more like a giant shell or something, while the middle of the core was where the meat of the core actually was. If I had to compare it to anything, it kind of reminded me of a rubber band ball in a way. One of those was made as a toy for the gimmick of the thing, with a bouncy rubber ball in the middle and all the other rubber bands wrapping around it as if it made sense. Here, with the blue core, a large chunk of the rubber bands had been cut away, which is bad, but then the rubber ball in the middle was also cut, which is worse. Pushing my musings and comparisons aside, I turn my attention over to Ravaya and watch as she sits on her knees across from me, her eyes closed and her head facing down to the core. She was in a sort of meditative state, and I could tell that she was thinking back on all kinds of information from her years of studies about various things that I'm not too sure about. Leaving her to think for a while longer, I glance over at Orwis, meeting her neatly unblinking gaze as she intently burns holes into the back of my head. I can sense she generally felt more at ease about everything to do with me, Ravaya, and Rita, though that did little in the face of her core essentially bleeding out mana. Her impatience and general worry were tangible, but more to the point, she was just confused as to what we intended to do to actually help. With each passing minute, I find my thoughts wondering the same thing as I look back to Ravaya once more when she starts to shift and stir from her own thoughts. She blinked with vague surprise upon noticing my gaze before offering a token glance towards Orwis, who was behind me. "Well, do you have any ideas?" I asked, while doing my very best to not sound too impatient. At that, Ravaya couldn't help but sigh softly before shaking her head. "I'm afraid not, Bitmori. When it comes down to it, there is not much known about repairing cores. The only studies I've come across are either about maintaining them or destroying them. There are likely not many cases actually recorded of innocent cores being cracked, but not outright destroyed. So I can't offer you any specific advice." I sighed for the sake of sighing when I looked back over at her again. "I thought you said you had some ideas. Can't we try any of those?" Ravaya looked slightly pained before hanging her head a little, some of her hair falling in front of her face when she shook her head once more. "My apologies, Bitmori. In the end, they were just ideas. After more thoroughly looking over the damage the core has suffered, I don't think I can justifiably recommend trying any of them without putting the core at further risk. In my humble opinion, we should just put this core back on its pedestal with the Zamzam tree roots. At least there it'll be stable until we can recover a staff made of its chunk from the Drake Wardens. If we have that, then I'm almost positive the core will be able to start properly recovering mostly on its own influence." I nodded intently, going back to pondering the blue orb before me. I don't know why, but through either some kind of intuition or gut feeling, I can't shake the thought that there's at least something I can do to help. "All right, so that'll keep it stable. And sure, it's been stable like this for the last few years at least. But I don't feel comfortable leaving it with what's essentially a bleeding wound. Isn't there anything we can do to at least stop it from leaking mana? Patch the crack somehow?" Ravaya looked more thoughtful at that. I could tell that she wasn't exactly sure what I was talking about. "What crack? Do you just want to fit an entire piece of something to fill the missing chunk of the core?" she asked, and it was only then that I realized that she may have fundamentally missed something that I had figured out. With that in mind, I couldn't help but feel a little excited as I shook my head before beckoning Ravaya to look closer, pointing at the thin, 2-inch-long crack along what I considered to be the meat of the core. "Look here, do you see that little crack around the middle of the core itself?" I asked before glancing up at Ravaya. She leaned in closely, her curiosity having been piqued as she studied the damaged core before spotting the innocuous little crack amongst the rest of the damage the core had suffered all those years ago. "Yeah? What about it?" It really doesn't look like much in the face of everything else that's happened with the entire missing chunk, she reasoned, sitting back and gesturing at the whole quarter of the core that was missing. I couldn't help but smile a bit, despite talking about something as macabre as the injuries of what is essentially a comatose person. I was just a little proud of the fact that I was able to figure something out that even Revire hadn't realized. That's where you're wrong. The crack is specifically what is causing this core to be leaking mana, and I think that if we are able to patch it, then it might be able to start building up its reserves more efficiently again. With that said, I could see something start to click for Revire as her eyes started to widen in understanding. Do you have clams in this world? I asked a little hopefully, wanting to try and better explain my reasoning. Even if Revire has memories of my world, I don't really think that she'd understand the example of a rubber ball band. Revire looked suitably taken aback by my tangent, but bobbed her head politely as she brought her hand up, brushing some hair away from her face before studying the blue core some more. We have a few types, yes, she said simply, her eyes now more thoroughly studying the crack that I pointed out while she stroked her chin in thought. Great. So think of cores like clams, I say, gesturing to the core again, which only earned an odd look from Revire as she quirked a brow at me. Choosing not to acknowledge that, I pressed forward with my example. See, with a clam, both the meat and the shell are part of them. They both grow and both have their purposes for the whole of the body. As time goes on, the clam of course grows, and the shell gets bigger, but so does the meat inside. The point I'm trying to make is that most of this core is just shell that grows and grows to accommodate the meat, but the layer of the sphere with the crack on its surface is the meat itself and the main body of the core. So, while the shell does not need to be repaired, the damage to the meat is the one causing the most overall trouble for the core. Revire nodded along to my example, and while I could sense she didn't really get the point in the way that I was trying to make it, she understood enough. So all we have to focus on right now is finding a way to mend the crack in the core's center and wait until the Drake Wardens bring the core's missing piece. That seems like more manageable task, Revire admitted as she scratched the back of her head before leaning in close to the core once more. In the next moment, she appeared to have an idea and started to reach into her robes, digging through the surprising number of hidden pockets before procuring a small pouch. Taking a moment to undo the knot that kept it shut, she poured it out into a palm, revealing quite a few purple shards. I couldn't help but be taken aback at the sight of them, as I somehow instinctively recognized them as pieces of Lictrin's core. I might have been much more obvious than I realized, as Revire suddenly appeared rather sheepish before holding the palmful of shards out to me. It only just occurred to me that I never asked if it was all right to keep these. My apologies, Footmori. It wasn't my intention to steal from you. I simply shook my head, leaning away from the offered shards at first, before sitting normally again. Don't worry about it. I just wasn't expecting you to suddenly have some pieces of her on hand. Where'd you get them from anyways? Revire retracted her hand as she looked over the shards in her palm once again before looking back at me. These are the scraps from when I made the vessel for your avatar. Even little shards like these are useful for making all sorts of tools, enchanted weapons, and magical focuses. I was hoping to experiment with them later, though perhaps they can be useful here, she offered with a sincere smile, looking back down at the shards in her palm before plucking up one of the smaller ones and placing it against the crack of the blue core. We both watched expectantly for a few moments, but nothing happened. It was around then that Always started to creep closer, my wooden ears pricking as the near-silent taps of her chitinous feet slowly meandered across the stone. I could feel her concern starting to spike once we started doing stuff to her core beyond looking and talking, though she didn't do more than just looking on with concern. I glance over at Always as she comes around the side of the core with the missing chunk, the concern plain on her face despite the nugget of trust that she has at the back of her head. Offering her my best reassuring smile, I turned my focus back on Revire and the core. I think I have the right idea, though I have the feeling we might need to actually fuse the shard into the core, rather than just fitting the shard into the crack. Revire nodded in silent agreement, though I could tell she didn't really have any ideas on how to actually go about doing that, which was a surprise to say the least. Leaving her to her thoughts, I decided to try and do that mana-swirling technique I used to fix up dread and gluttony to try and fuse the shard into the crack. I'm worried I might overwhelm or maybe even erase the core if I used too much mana, kind of like how I erased whatever was on the crystal in the ooze spring outside of Lictrin's core room. So, with that in mind, I focus on conjuring a mana needle, that way that Rita had shown me when we took apart the slate brands, the small sliver of nearby tangible mana appearing between my fingers as I set to work. I could hear Ravaya questioning how I intended to fuse the pieces, but she soon went silent as I carefully needled the shards of Lictrin's core with as little mana as possible. I'm not sure how much time passes, but what I do know is that I'm just happy that my wooden body has no need to breathe, can't sweat, and responds to my precise instructions with no errant twitching or shaking. Slowly but surely, the purple shard becomes green due to what I believe is the influence of my mana, and the shard itself gradually loses its shape under the consistent but minute injections of mana. The whole process vaguely reminds me of melting a piece of rock candy, the liquefied shard, filling the crack almost seamlessly when I finally pulled the needle away and dispelled it. With the leak plugged up, I could sense a faint shift within the core and watch as the now green shard and the faintly green core crystal grow around the shard turned blue like the rest of the core. But the core itself has slumbered and didn't react much more than that. While I don't know much about core physiology, I think it's safe to say that the transfusion of core materials was successful. At least, it didn't look to be rejecting the material. Before I realized it, a very excited Ravaya was at my side, shaking me by the shoulder, causing me to rock side to side as I didn't really bother to resist her. "That was amazing! How did you do that? No, what did you even do?" she asked, before looking over to the core again. Always, for her part, had approached the core itself, gingerly plucking it from the pedestal with her good hand, holding it close to herself as she presented her forehead to it before closing her eyes. Within that moment, I could feel a sensation of relief wash over her. While her core wasn't restored just yet, it had been healed and could start building its strength back up, which was a huge improvement over the previous situation these last few years. It took me a moment to refocus on everything around me, as I hadn't realized that I had gotten into the zone, as it were. Rita had returned at some point, sitting beside Ravaya, who was previously sitting, a journal of some kind along with a pencil in her hands. It looks like she was taking notes, though about what I hadn't the foggiest clue. "What do you mean? I was just using the mana needle to fuse Lictrin's core shard to this core," I finally replied to Ravaya, having needed a moment to remember she was asking me a question. "But how did you figure that out? How did you know what to do, or that it would even work?" she pressed. Reflexively, I felt that she was almost accusing me of something, or that I was doing something I wasn't supposed to. But in the next moment, I could tell that she was genuinely curious and excited about seeing something she didn't fully understand. I couldn't help but flash a cheerful smile as I scratched my cheek. "I'm not really sure how to explain it, but I guess that you could call it a mix of intuition and a hunch. We can talk about this later. For now, we should finish things up with Orwis." Ravaya sighed with a vague disappointment, but I could sense that she was still satisfied with having watched me the entire time, along with the note that she took with Rita. Releasing my shoulder, she turned to face Orwis and flashed her a kind smile. "Now that your core is stable, let's get them back on the pedestal with the Zamzam trees so that they can start collecting more mana. They're going to be getting better from now on, so don't you worry," she expressed rather kindly, speaking to Orwis in a gentle way. Orwis flinched for a moment when Ravaya approached, but was soon calm enough to even allow Ravaya to place a hand on a good shoulder. To think that Ravaya could easily be so kind to someone she considered a deadly monster only a couple days ago. It's probably only like this due to her one-sided familiarity with Orwis after watching her grow up. Not to mention, Orwis isn't even in her first decade, and Ravaya has a couple of centuries on everyone here. If an old man like me is young compared to Ravaya, then Orwis must be equivalent to a toddler. "Well, the day isn't getting any younger. Let's get going and check in with Ururu while we're at it," I enthused, hoping to set everyone in motion. I get a nod here and there from the mages, while Orwis spins up another sling with a spider silk, securing the core behind her at the base of a humanoid half and a spider half body. Rita spoke up, looking vaguely amused as we started walking out. "The day has been over for a good while, Mori. Just so you know," she said, with a kind but teasing way. "Really? But the sun was barely setting when we just got started." But it was clear to me that how late it was when I spotted the twin moons so high in the sky once we left the medbay. I couldn't help but wonder how many hours I worked to fuse that core shard without overwhelming the blue core. "Oh damn! It is rather late. Have you all eaten?" I asked while looking among the trio. Orwis didn't verbally respond, but I could sense that she was fine. Ravaya just shrugged a bit before starting to stretch and pop her back. "Nah, I'll eat tomorrow. I have a lot of notes that need reviewing right now, she enthused happily enough, while clutching the journal that Rita had close to her chest. Satisfied with that, I turned to look over at Rita for her answer. It took her a moment to realize that I was waiting on her. She flashed a bit of a smile as she absently stretched and flapped her wings behind her. Me and him had me eat with him and some others, so yeah, I've got something to eat. I was satisfied with that answer, though I could sense Revi was extremely pleased with her answer for whatever reason. I didn't bother to pry, but I could tell when her mother was trying to sell the idea of his son to another girl, and I definitely wasn't expecting to see that happening here. Before long, we had descended my mountain, going to the other side towards the spider's nest. Even at this late hour, we came across a few wolves here and there, dutifully following the orders I had given Lugosi. I was making my way to the hole that I had burned through the maze of webs when Orvis insisted I followed her. I didn't see any point in not following, so I ultimately obliged her, as she now led us to a flap hidden in the wall of webs, which brought us to the corridor within. Ah, I see. She wanted to use the front door instead of the shortcut I made for myself. As we walked through the maze, she guided us through an assortment of trap chambers and rooms specifically built for ambushes. It made me wonder how long it might have taken to get through the maze if I had done it properly, or if I hadn't set Jack to run a diversion to gather the spiders elsewhere. How would I have done it? Or would I have just burned the whole place down in my impatience? It didn't take us much longer, and after crossing through another hidden flap in the wall of webs, we finally returned to the core room to see Ururu surrounded by large spiders who were supposedly the guardians of the core room. That wasn't until we entered. The massive spiders all turned to see us come in, before skittering over towards Orvis like excited, oversized dogs. Orvis chatted to them with a small smile on her face, before holding out the core for them to see. To say that the spiders were excited was an understatement, as they collectively did what they could only describe as some kind of happy dance. However, the spiders soon dispersed on her orders with an almost literal skip in their step. While they were doing that, Revire had made her way over to the Zamzam trees, seemingly studying them and scratching at the bark, among other things, as she narrated her findings to Rita, who dutifully took notes for her in Revire's journal. Leaving the mages to their studies, I approached Ururu, who regarded me with a deep bow of his head, making use of the long neck to do so without moving his torso. Welcome back, and congratulations on your success in healing the other core, he enthused with reserved cheerfulness. I smiled a bit and bobbed my head. Thanks, Ururu. How about you? Have you found anything of interest around here? I asked as I stood beside him, watching with him as more and more spiders started filling the core room, quickly becoming an arachnophobe's worst nightmare. The spiders began rhythmically moving from side to side as they encircled the pedestal in the center of the core room, watching closely, as Orvis made a show of lifting the core above her head with one hand, before carefully sitting it down and back in its pedestal again. It looked as if the bass was just dropped in the nightclub, and the spiders essentially danced with joy at the return of the healed core. Ururu spoke up once the spiders got started with their thing, shrugging his shoulders before regarding me. I didn't find much, but I did find a lot of stones under the dirt that were evenly spaced out into rows and columns. I think one of the Zamzam trees was planted behind one of the stones, because it's really tangled with the roots now. It took me a moment to really understand what he told me, my attention still mostly on the dancing spiders. However, it soon clicked as he shared that mental impression of what he saw, and after he actually described it, I couldn't help but regard it with a quirked brow. Are you saying that we are standing in an ancient graveyard? Ururu tilted his head curiously, seemingly thinking about my question before bobbing his head. Yes, that's a suitable description of what I saw. I wasn't really sure what to say, turning to look amongst the dancing spiders again before scratching the back of my head. Well, how about that? The graveyard. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: DragonSoup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Lightjock, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Lord Azrekahl. Thank you very much.